Hello, everyone. This is Thierry ARYS RUIZ here, your host for this fireside chat with Mr. Rick Rule, investor and speculator. I have the pleasure to welcome him for this talk at the Bastiat Society for the Swiss chapter. As you know, Switzerland is a big commodity nation, and I think there was no better person to welcome than Rick Rule. So Rick, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm particularly delighted to address the Swiss chapter, given how welcoming Switzerland has been to me as a business and investment destination, and also, frankly, how much fun I've had visiting Switzerland over the last 4 decades.
Well, you're welcome anytime. And just to jump into it, the overall topic of this talk is free market capitalism, and with a big question mark of, are we still in a free market capitalism? So let's jump right into it. What would be your first thought when you hear that question?
My first thought is that, at least in my memory, I haven't seen a jurisdiction anywhere in the world that evidenced free market capitalism. Perhaps in the 1950s, the British did a reasonable job with introducing some form of free market capitalism to Hong Kong. But from my point of view, most of the efforts at capitalism that we've seen around the world have been more statist and corporatist. The cynic would say fascist. Certainly, there are jurisdictions in the world where individual rights and voluntarism are more prominent than others. You can usually identify those because they're more prosperous than other places. And I would point as an example to Switzerland as being one of those. But to say that even Switzerland doesn't have legislation that favors one political group or one economic group or one social group over another, I think is fallacious. I just think that you measure societies by how voluntary the transactions between people are. And the best that you can hope for in the present circumstance is a less intrusive rather than an unobtrusive state.
Yeah, I mean, you made a good point, and I think it was Milton Friedman who was saying that there is no such thing as communism. Everything is capitalism. Even communism is capitalism. It's just that all the capital is owned by the state. So the real question, I guess, is, are we seeing free markets or not? Because once we establish that all states also act as capitalists, the rule of law is somewhat what matters when it comes to free markets. So, what is your opinion on that? Am I wrong there?
No, I think you're right. I need to disclaim that I'm neither an economist nor a political scientist. I'm an investor and a speculator, and I wouldn't want my comments to be subjected to rigorous academic analysis. My experience observing these phenomena as an investor is that economies that can't get any worse get better, meaning that political actors in the state begin to steal less when there's nothing left to steal. An example would be the Congo in 1996, after a civil war that killed 2 million people, where there was a complete breakdown in the ability of the state to impose tyranny because they couldn't afford to pay their soldiers. You began to have some economic freedom because the state couldn't afford to suppress it anymore. Similarly, societies that have done very well for a very long period of time begin to get complacent with freedom, and some economic groups get envious relative to other economic groups. One example of that would be Chile today. Chile is different than the rest of South America because, albeit in brutal fashion, they began to employ more voluntarist methods in their economy 40 years ago. They were, of course, aided by the fact that they had 40% of the world's copper production. But ironically, they allowed the private sector to come in and compete with the public sector in the copper business. 40 years later, Chile is the most prosperous nation in South America, and they've decided to kill the goose that laid the golden egg by greatly increasing taxation and regulation on the copper industry and strengthening the underperforming state-owned firm, Codelco, relative to the private sector firms that have brought all the wealth to Chile. It's ironic that countries do the right thing when they have no other choice. As soon as they build up enough wealth through more voluntarism, the political process acts to redistribute that wealth, not to those who generated it, but rather to those who have the ability through votes to steal it.
So it seems to be more the political process that does that rather than the economic reasonable thing to do. You seem to point out at some sort of a cycle for which when people or nations are poor and there is nothing left to steal, it is left for the free market enterprise to go on. And then once there is wealth, then people start demanding for welfare in some sort. And so there is a cycle. Where do you see the world as a whole in that cycle? Do you think we're going towards more statism, or do you think there is hope for more liberty?
No, I think we're going fairly rapidly towards more a greater state involvement. I think that people are demanding this. We're in a cycle of envy. And there will be a response to this. I remember the sort of Reagan and Thatcher, and by the way, I'm not describing either of them as libertarian free market types. I'm just describing them as more conservative anchors after a period of reversion to the left. There will be a reaction to the increasing levels of statism that we see. One example would be a response in the European Union, but in particular, I think in Germany, to the whole perceived energy and climate crisis. The Germans are rich enough that they have decided that they can de-emphasize nuclear power in favor of solar, which is an ironic choice in a place where the sun doesn't shine. The consequence of that is that, of course, they've had to greatly increase their coal consumption at the same time that retail power bills have tripled. At some point in time, common people begin to question the sanity of the big thinkers with regards to policy decisions like this. And they begin to think, although I don't want to make my own decisions, I would prefer that the big thinkers make my life perfect. The track record of the big thinkers over the last decade is so pathetic that I have to take control of my future into my own hands as much as I can. So and again, I'm not an economist. I speak from really 45 years experience investing in the natural resource business in countries around the globe. And I look at this sort of periodicity or cyclicality in countries and societies, not based on any academic study, but rather based on my ability to participate in their economy, my ability to speculate on either their recovery or their deterioration.
So we're going to get to the cyclicality a little bit after. It's funny you mentioned electricity, because I was in France at the time where the French company of electricity, state-owned, was having a lot of difficulties to compete with the German electricity, and it was actually the Germans who basically shot themselves in the foot that made the French all of a sudden much more competitive, which is kind of ironic. But going back to the free market topic and to the cyclical topics, I used to read Costolani and the Costolani egg with the cycles of Fed rate increases and decreases. And the rule of thumb was basically don't fight the Fed. The question I have a lot right now is, what is the Fed doing?
Right now, if you're talking about the US Fed, rather than the Euro Fed, if such a thing exists, yeah. The US Fed has put so much liquidity in the economy, and the US economy is also beginning to enter, at least a short term, I would say, consumer boom phase, that the Fed has been able to allow the interest rate to rise. This is important because if the Fed needs a fiscal tool other than counterfeiting, which is what I call quantitative easing. If they need a second policy tool after counterfeiting in the next economic downturn, they need the ability to lower interest rates. So the Fed has, I hate to use the word taper because that has political connotations, but they have reduced their level of yield curve management. Yield curve management in the United States was selling short-term securities to fund the purchase of long-term securities and bring down the effective interest rate in the economy. This interest rate management was such that they brought down the yield on the US 10-year Treasury to 60 basis points. It's really difficult, although I know the Europeans have done it, to take interest rates sub-zero. The Fed has allowed the yield on the US 10-year Treasury to go from 60 basis points to 175 basis points, giving them the tools, if they need to cut rates again, and of course, allowing the US dollar to firm. I don't believe that the Fed has any business manipulating interest rates personally, but sadly, the Fed doesn't listen to me too often. I think it's fair to say, too, that the political elites in the United States, be it the elected elites, the senior bureaucrats, or the Fed, are all both philosophically and practically in the mindset that it is their duty to manipulate the economy. It is their duty to pick winners and losers. It's their duty to maintain artificially low interest rates. One of the ongoing features of a representative democracy is that the powers of the state be used as ammunition in an age-old war between spenders and savers. Savers are scarce. They're not a particularly potent voting group, although they're a very potent donating group.
They can work out.
Yes. Savers are numerous, spenders are numerous. And so left to the popular vote, the spenders always vote to plunder the savers. Traditionally, the savers have defended themselves with campaign contributions. If you remember the great quote by the American journalist H.L. Mencken, that elections are advanced auctions of stolen property, very often relative to their numbers, the savers have been high bid because they donate more. But in a representative democracy, you almost always see a circumstance during prosperity where spenders vote to take down the savers. And that's precisely what you're seeing today.
Do you think it is changing now? Because I tend to believe that perhaps now when you look at bigger nations, savers decide to vote with their feet and vote with their wallet. And, you know, I'm in Switzerland here. I feel like this has been always true, right? You don't see people from South Korea walking to North Korea. You see the opposite. So it's always been true this way. So do you think there is a point where the cycle of the nation has reached peak, and so from there on it moves to another country where it has been mismanaged? I mean, I see, for example, even Switzerland as a whole, there's a lot of competition from Singapore eating into the same types of markets. Do you think now it's still true that the powers are being like advanced auctions, or do you think that it is a system that has been kind of like rigged in a way where those who know have safe havens and those who don't then don't?
I think both of those are true. I think there has always been a circumstance in society where people who were self-aware, self-reliant, and had the courage to self-actualize understood that their loyalty is to humankind rather than to any individual nation state. And those people have chosen, like in Atlas Shrugged, to vote with their feet. Doug Casey, whom you're probably familiar with, says that the most intelligent individual response, and pardon the jocular nature of this, but the most efficient individual response is to have your assets, your passport, and your ass in 3 different locales, meaning that you aren't reliant on any one nation state. If you could arrange your affairs ideally, you might live in a society that seemed pleasant to you in a climate that was good. You would have a passport that gave you the most visa-free travel that you could accomplish in the world, and also, of course, manage your tax status. But you would have your assets domiciled in a place that you neither lived nor had your passport in, thereby freeing you to the greatest extent possible of the depredation of the rest of society. I think, however, that most of humankind doesn't want to do that. Most of humankind doesn't want to take control of their financial future. Most of humankind doesn't want to understand that wealth is simply the surplus saved between the utility that they generated for others, which is what they got paid for, and the utility that they consumed. Most people believe in the commonwealth, which is to say that most people in the world believe that all of the wealth in the world is in some form the common property of mankind, and that the political process is to redistribute it, particularly in ways that are beneficial to one's own sense of well-being. So my suspicion is that the Italian social philosopher Pareto answered your question for you in the sense that Pareto's law is the popularization of the 80-20 rule, where 20% of the population generates 80% of the utility. A different 20% of the population generates 80% of the disutility. And of course, those performance dispersal curves are repeated 10,000 times over various functions. So I think what you find is that maybe 20% of society, but much more likely 20% of 20%, which is to say 4% of society prefers to be self-actualizing. 80% of society prefers to rely on the big thinkers, sadly.
But then I would almost say that it applies within a fractalian way, kind of.
You are correct.
You mentioned the 20% of the wealth, for example, the 20% of people who would have 80% of the wealth, but then within those 20%, now it has reached the point where it's almost 1% to 90-something%. So Mandelbrot would also see some patterns there within that philosophy, I think. Going back to the topic of free markets and the Fed, I think it is fundamental to understand, because you were talking about the management of interest rates. So if they were on a free market, we would not have that management word in there. So do you think it all starts from the fact that the most important price, which is the price of money, is not a free market determined price?
I don't know if that's the most important aspect, but it's certainly the most overreaching. The idea that the market can't determine the price of the medium of exchange, I guess, guarantees that there isn't a free market in any place where there is control over the relative valuations of the medium of exchange. I think the second determinant, before we get down into regulation, but the second determinant is probably the central control of so many spending decisions in society and the ability of the political elites to borrow based on the commonwealth. Debt and deficits are really at the root of it, among other things, an intergenerational transfer of wealth.
So if you look at for example, Navigating Big Debt Crisis by Ray Dalio, he explains also some sort of a cyclicality into the money printing, which is not really money, it's all credit, right? So at the end of the day, I mean, if I look at Adam Smith, right, it says that money is gold, but then when you look at the unpegging of money from gold, and then having a monetary system which is actually a credit system, and credit is then assimilated to a monetary mass, right? So you see patterns of monetary expansion and monetary collapse usually, because the collapse usually happens much faster. It's kind of like waking up with a hangover, right? So within that cycle, a lot of people are still asking themselves, where is the needle? Is the needle going to tilt towards a fat tail event as everything is over leveraged? Is the needle going to tilt towards a hyperinflation, or is the needle going to tilt towards a deflationary crisis? Which one of the two you think will happen first?
I wouldn't want to speak in terms of certainties because I don't think that there is a certainty. The probability is this: excessive debt and the fact that societies have lived beyond their means is deflationary. You deal with that debt through default. There are two forms of default. You could have an honest default, where the government says, with regards to off-balance sheet liabilities like pensions or on-balance sheet liabilities like bonds, too bad, so sad, can't pay, we're broke, goodbye. An honest default. Not pleasant, but honest. Traditionally, if we can afford it, we have dishonest defaults, which is to say that the policy response to a deflationary event is to inflate away the net present value of the obligation. That's what the United States did in the 1970s. We had the hangover from the war on poverty, which of course we lost, and the war in Vietnam, which we also lost. And there was a bill left over, a relatively large bill relative to our ability to service it. And what we did was we inflated away the net present value of the purchasing power of those obligations. Rather than have an honest default, we had a dishonest default. An honest default is deflationary. A dishonest default is inflationary. I think that the probability is that there is enough wealth in society, enough faith in governments, misplaced faith to be true, to be sure, and enough creativity, that is to say, enough wealth generating capability in the private sector, that we will be able to afford a dishonest default, and that we will inflate away the net present value of many of the obligations that we have endured. My suspicion, too, is that the political response will come over the next decade to swing back to the type of government response that became popular in the early part of the decade of the 80s, which is to say leadership of the Reagan and Thatcher ilk. But I think that'll come 10 years from now, after we've experimented with other forms first.
You made me think of a conversation I had with my father not so long ago, because he's retired, and I looked at his position as if similar to what the government debt is going, because today's pension funds have a big problem with deficits, right? And so I want to put across a theory. I want to have your opinion on that. I told him, look, Dad, most likely there is three ways that they will not be able to pay your retirement. The first one is they will be pushing the maturity, just like a bond, further. So instead of retiring at 50 before, they will probably push it at 55. In Germany, it's 59. And so they will push the maturity. That's one way. The second way, it's kind of refinancing, right? The second way is to inflate the money maybe 30%. So let's say if the actuarians figure out that if they push by 5 years, they will eliminate 30% of the people claiming on their pensions before they actually can claim them. The second way would be to inflate 30% of the money. So they might owe you 1,000 euros. They promise you 1,000 euros, but that 1,000 euros by the time you retire is just about worth 700 euros. And then the last one is to haircut, like kind of like what we saw in Greece, is recognizing that they are broke, and so essentially having a haircut, and this will be the most honest default that you were talking about. I feel like by looking at those three, the honest default is out of the table because it's not politically correct. So therefore, it seems like we only are left with inflation and carry on the maturity. And so you do 30%, 30%, and 30%, and you end up with nothing. So do you think this is the way that we will solve the same problem for, in a macro scale for governments?
Yes, is the answer. I think that weaker societies that are financed by stronger societies, in a very ugly sense, which is to say, Portugal and Greece, which are financed by Germany, countries like that, occasionally are forced to have an honest default because the Germans don't want to subsidize dishonesty in Greece. They only want to subsidize dishonesty in Germany. For Northern Europe, the answer, I think, will be very much, when they can't afford it, to, as you say, extend it, and also to inflate away the net present value of the purchasing power. I don't know the comparable European statistics, but I know that when Social Security was instituted in the United States in the Franklin Delano Roosevelt era in the early 1930s, that Social Security began when you were 65 years of age. And the average life expectancy of an American male was 66 years, which meant that Social Security, the social safety net, was meant to save you from abject poverty. You were still very poor, but from abject poverty for 1 year. The average life expectancy of an American male now, as I understand it, is 84 or 85 years. And the benefits have become substantially more generous and, by the way, indexed. The social safety net that was put in place in the United States in the 1930s, while it wouldn't have been what I would have described as a free market alternative to savings, was affordable because there was an enormous demographic bulge of younger workers. And the cost on society involved looking after the final year of a retired worker's life. The social promises like Social Security, like unemployment, like the various very popular social welfare programs are extremely popular with spenders, less popular, of course, with savers. And the consequence of that is that they are constantly being increased, while at the same time, the ability of society to pay for them doesn't increase. So at some point in time, you run into a breaking point. And I think that the way that the probability is the way that voters and governments deal with it is the way that is the least painful at the time. And I suspect what you will see on both sides of the Atlantic, and in fact around the world, will be with increasing health standards and increasing life expectancies, that the stipulated retirement ages will continue to increase. I don't think that's a bad thing. I'm a 68-year-old, allegedly retired. I'm spending 50 or 55 hours a week working. It's had no deleterious impact on me. I think, too, that it's extremely likely that the way that we deal with the net present value of the entire corpus of the welfare state is to inflate away the purchasing power of the obligation. I think that's very important. There's a third way, of course. And again, I don't want to speak in the European context because I don't understand it as well as I do the American context. But in the United States, the net present value of our off-balance sheet liabilities, which is to say the net present value of entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the various trust funds and the like, exceeds now, according to the Congressional Budget Office, $125 trillion. Trillion, that's a T.
There are the unfunded liabilities you're talking about.
Correct. The net present value, not the gross, the discounted net present value of those liabilities, the net present value today of the benefits that need to be paid out over time. This is unsustainable. We are funding this liability with a budget that's in deficit $4 trillion a year. In other words, rather than service it, we add to it. One way to look at this problem, if one is your age, is to say, okay, Rick, you're 68 years of age. You voted yourself all these wonderful benefits, but you forgot to pay for them. If you want them, you pay for them because I'm not going to. One thing that you could do is understand that the net present value of the unfunded liabilities are really a transfer of society's wealth to old people who voted themselves these benefits from young people who will have to pay for them. And there could be a political response, which would be very unpopular with people of my age, but would be entirely rational for people of your age.
I think there's a population problem as well, because the defaults of a democracy is also the constituents sometimes, right? So if the constituents are getting older, then you have trouble having that. Talking about deficits and unfunded liability, if you are fiscally responsible, you can easily get nightmares if you visit usdebtclock.org and just see the numbers going with, I believe I can open it right now. I think there's hundreds of thousands of dollars per US taxpayer today in order to be able to remove that debt. So I think it becomes really clear mathematically that this debt will not be able to be paid. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out, I think. But going back to the inflation topic, and before we leave, I think a lot of people want to have some sort of an insight from your investment background, your investment perspective. You've been in the gold market with Sprott for a long time. What is your perspective as of to now, and where there can be possibilities to protect yourself from what could be coming economically?
Well, certainly that's a self-serving question, given that I'm in the precious metals markets, among others. Historically, precious metals have done well for many reasons, having to do with fear, in particular fear of the purchasing power of conventional savings instruments denominated in fiat currencies, be they euros or dollars. I believe currently those fears are very well founded for the reasons that we've spent half an hour talking about. But to enumerate them: quantitative easing, the debasement of the currency, the debasement of fiat currency. If you did it, if you decided that you were going to print up some euros just to help the cause, it would be called counterfeiting. But if the European Union does it, it's called quantitative easing. It's very, very popular, but there's no doubt that it debases the currency. The second, of course, is debt and deficits. Debt and deficits have two problems. They become unserviceable and they call into question the social equation going forward, but they also debase the credit quality of debt issuers, sovereign debt issuers. People forget about credit quality. Look back to Weimar Germany to determine how this ends in the European context. It's not pretty. The third, in the nearer term, is negative real interest rates. There's nothing that bothers savers more than negative real interest rates. And negative real interest rates are not forces of nature. The idea that a saver would pay a spender in order to forego consumption is, on the face of it, absolutely silly. If you look at the value proposition offered up by the US 10-year Treasury, arguably the world's benchmark security, it's preposterous. The US government, maybe for the first time in my life, is telling me the absolute truth. They're telling me that if I give them money today, they'll give me back less. In fact, much less 10 years from now. Jim Grant calls that return-free risk. Precisely, they're going to pay me 175 basis points, 1.75% interest, in a currency where the purchasing power is depreciating by 4.5% a year. They're guaranteeing to give me 2.25% compounded less over 10 years. Now, if anything could make somebody concerned about the depreciation of the purchasing power of their savings, it's negative real interest rates. All three of those are very good for precious metals, sadly. Bad for society, good for precious metals. There's a fourth piece of arithmetic that I want to leave with you too, which has to do with the upside in gold. Precious metals and precious metals related securities, and this is a US number, not a global number, comprise about 0.5% of total savings and investment products in the United States, which is to say they're a tiny asset class. Gold doesn't need to win the war against the US dollar. It needs to lose it less badly. If it was to revert to mean, the mean market share of precious metals in the US savings and investment market is between 1.5% and 2%. If the combination of quantitative easing, debt and deficits, negative real interest rates were merely to change savers' perceptions enough that the market share of precious metals and precious metals related assets in the United States market would revert to the 3-decade mean, you would see a tripling or a quadrupling of demand for precious metals and precious metals related assets, which is precisely what I think is going to happen.
Well, I think your fourth point is kind of a gem there, because that's also where your experience plays in. And then one of the two things that you mentioned first was the return-free risk is basically turning into a guaranteed loss. And the second thing you mentioned is the fiscal policy and monetary policy. And the recent example that I look at is Mario Draghi, who was in both sides of the fence. So what happens when it's the same person leading both, or somewhat having the same experience? And now you have Christine Lagarde, who used to be in France, who is now at the ECB. So there seems to be an increasing revolving door there between nation states taking care of the finances, or actually not taking care of their finances, and the central banks. Thank you a lot, Rick. We're hitting the end. I'm sure we could go on and on, but I appreciate a lot your insights and for sharing. I hope to have another opportunity to speak to you again. And okay, so on that note, Rick, I appreciate you coming here and spending some time with us. I'm sure that this was very worthy for everybody, and I wish everybody else to have a good day and to see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
This was a conversation with Rick Rule, legendary investor and speculator. Follow the AIER Bastiat Society, like, share, and subscribe. With the links below, you will find more information about Rick and also the AIER Bastiat Society. I'm looking forward to see you very soon.